right. Good morning. Welcome to the neighborhood. Speaking of neighborhood, we had our neighbors over last night. Not Elfie and I, but our church family right over here in the park. Had about, 600-700 of our neighbors to a fall festival and then a movie in the evening. For those of you that responded last week to thinking of ways to engage our neighbors, and you helped in one way or another yesterday, thank you for that. You represented Jesus well, and it was really a great day to serve our neighbors, so thank you for that. So I want to dive right in this morning and just bring you up to speed really quickly. 3 weeks ago, when we started this series, we talked about this passage of Scripture that Jesus repeats several times, where he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And we talked a little bit about how he's the first person with authority to kind of connect the vertical relationship to the horizontal, and those are just inseparable. Then last week we talked about, well, what does neighbor love really look like? And this week I want to look a little bit at another couple of stories that Jesus has for us, where he really thinks together with us, what is the way to think about a neighbor? And how do we think of who our neighbors are? In 1969, episode 195 of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, he portrays something in a masterful presentation of a social issue that was really hot at that time. The 1950s and 1960s, if anything marked our country, it was the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King and young 14-year-old boy, Emmett Till, I think his name was, that was hung because of his ethnicity and his skin color by some white folks, and some Jim Crow laws, just this stuff going on. And Mr. Rogers was never hesitant to deal with those kinds of social issues. And watch what he does with Officer Clemens in this video clip. So if that pool and the washing of some feet reminds you of an incident from the Bible, it's meant to. That was in Fred Rogers' heart and mind when he washed Officer Clemens' feet and handed him his towel. Because Mr. Rogers thought about people, neighbors, differently than so many people in our culture did. There was a category that Mr. Rogers put people in that was really broad, unlike the culture and unlike our culture today, as a matter of fact, that tends to categorize people in narrow categories. And once you're in that category, you're in that category. But Fred Rogers had this unique way with kids of saying there's a category of love, and it turns out every human being fits in that category of love. Does that remind you of someone else? That's who we follow. Our leader does that. You know, it's so interesting. When Jesus walks onto this planet, he comes with what could be thought of as a religious message, or he could be thought of as a message from God for humanity. But it's the people who are non-religious that gravitate toward him and found him interesting and found him captivating. And the religious people of his day didn't so much gravitate toward him. He had different categories for people and different ways of thinking of them than the people of his day. People who you would think had similar interests. You'd think they would gravitate toward him, but they don't. People who have different interests than him, even if they disagreed with him, were compelled and were drawn and magnetized to him. And it appears that Jesus intentionally engages with and spends a vast majority of his time with people who are most unlike him. Intentionally so. It's not just that's how it happened. He does it intentionally and then it happens. It's so interesting that people that were least like Jesus liked Jesus. And he liked them back, apparently. Why would that be? Well, maybe it has to do with how people are categorized and how Jesus thought about people and how he thought about who neighbors really were. People who were most uncomfortable and ostracized by the whole temple scene, the ceremony, the sacrifices, the insider language, the clothing, the hierarchy, and so on, were most comfortable with Jesus. Jesus went to non-religious people, and large crowds of non-religious people gathered around him. Now, what's so particular and peculiar and controversial in the first century when this happened was how people were categorized in the first century Jewish culture. This is how they typically were categorized. They were categorized as in or out. You were one or the other. You were either disconnected from God or you were connected to God. Those were the only two real categories. You were either moving toward God if you were on the in, and you were necessarily moving away from God if you were on the out. So who were the in people in this culture? There was a clear dividing line. It wasn't ambiguous. It was really clear. So on the right-hand side of this dividing line, of course, there would be the priests, the religious people. There would be the scholars, the Sadducees and Pharisees, the lawyers, the judges, those kinds of people who settled cases of religious law. And generally, if you were a Jew, you were clearly on that side. Now, you could also become a Jew of sorts. You could become a proselyte. So if you weren't a Jew, there were certain ceremonies that you could go through. You had to bring an animal sacrifice, and you had to be circumcised. That's a disturbing image right there, right? And you had to be baptized. You had to go into the river and baptize yourself. And you came out renouncing all other gods and faiths and so on, and you could now be a proselyte Jew. That's a Jew with an asterisk. But if you were there, you were on the in. That's who you were. So who were the people on the out? Well, everybody else. You just had to be a Gentile and you were on the out. But if you were a sinner, like you obviously were breaking the Jewish law, which most Gentiles did in one fashion or another, particularly Sabbath laws, but if there were other moral laws and so on, you clearly were a sinner on the left-hand side, and you were out. You were not in the in group. Well, there was nobody actually coming forward to say that you could, if you were first on the jagged side of the line, because if you were, you couldn't really get to the other side. Well, I guess if you were close to that proselyte, you could if you wanted to make that route. But there was another line that was even left of that, and if you were there, there was no hope back. That you couldn't make it back. Tax collectors, adulterers, prostitutes, this list of people. And what happened is, you would be categorized into one of these categories. Everybody did it. People who were in the category to the left did it to the people on the right. People on the right side of the categories did it to the people on the left. That's just how they thought about culture. That's how they managed things. And there was really nobody coming forward and saying that people on the left side of that demarcation were actually worthy of any kind of neighbor love. There was nobody stepping forward from the right side saying, well, we have to love sinners. No, we need to reject sinners. We need to stay away from them. They're untouchable. We don't have anything to do with them. This was the culture, and this is how it worked. So what made it so controversial and shocking when Jesus came along and said, no, that's not how this actually works. And then he goes ahead and spends most of his time with people on the left side of that continuum. That created problems for everybody on the right side because he was supposed to be a right side guy. But he doesn't spend his time with right-sided people. He spends his time with left-sided people. And that created a problem for him. And Jesus was aware of it. And I would say it again, over and over again, people who were least like Jesus, and he liked them. And here's the thing. You and I, over and again, in the New Testament depictions of Jesus and his message and who he is, we are told repeatedly that we, with his passing and sending the Holy Spirit, we are the body of Christ. What does that mean? That means that what was personal and particular to Jesus is now collectively who we are. We increasingly think like him. We increasingly take on his disposition. Over and over again, this is what we're told. That we have, like Jesus, actually a different set of categories of how we think of people. Because he had different categories of how he thought about people. And so this is who we are to be. What are our categories? Well, we think of people educated or uneducated, right? We categorize people that way. We still do it by race, actually. Rich and poor, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Independent. Those are all categories we put people in, correct? Good people, bad people, moral people. We measure people by their sexuality, measure by their morality, and we drop them into categories. What if Jesus doesn't drop people into those categories? What if he doesn't even have those categories? Would we look at things differently? Would we see the world differently? Would we see people differently? Is it possible that we might see people, neighbors if you will, a little more like Jesus sees neighbors? How we categorize people, or words we use to describe people, or adjectives, if you will, that we use to describe people, say a lot about how we think about people. They reveal what we think about them. And so did Jesus' adjectives. So did Jesus' descriptors tell us a lot about how he thought about people. So this morning, I want to take us through a series of 3 stories really quickly, because these are so familiar, you might even be tempted to nod off, they're so familiar to you. Or because it's not all that captivating when I tell them. Okay, it could be that too. But these 3 stories together will unpack a little bit of the adjectives, the descriptive words that Jesus uses to describe people. And hold on to this one. These are people that he prioritized in his life. Prioritized. Now that's not fair, Jesus. You love everybody the same. You shouldn't prioritize people. Tell him that. Because this is what he does. And again, remember, we're the body of Christ. And what's real for him personally is to be who we are collectively. So Luke chapter 15, just giving the reference will trigger some of you for what these stories are about. This is actually the way it starts. Luke 15, chapter 1, it says, tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. There are the cultural categories again. Put up our deal up again here. So these were people on the left side. Sinners, that's one of them, like notorious sinners, like they're even left of that sinner. And in the far, like never hope you could ever get back kind of person, a tax collector. They were in that list. This is who's coming to see Jesus. Over and again, Jesus would show up in the same place or new places, and he would teach beside a body of water on a hillside. And who showed up? People who were least like Jesus. Who stayed till the end? People who were least like Jesus. Now, there were some others who thought Jesus should be something other than what he was that showed up as well, because we read this in verse 2. It says, this made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law who also were there, they were complaining about what? Well, that he was associating with such sinful people. And not just associating with them, but in their homes having dinner with them. Shocker, horror. Isn't that awful? Well, it was to them. And of course, they were upset with Jesus, and they were complaining about what he was doing. They weren't happy with Jesus. You see, Jesus, you came with a religious message. We're religious people. You came with a message about God. So we're the insiders. Like we're in with God. So shouldn't you be in with us? Because that's who you should prioritize. Well, worse than that, Jesus is actually hanging out with out crowd. And he's giving them his time and his attention. And they condemn them, the outsiders, for being outsiders. And Jesus seems just so happy to actually validate their humanity. Now, this is not just a one-way street. The out folks describe the ins in down-putting kind of adjectives as well. So Jesus kind of, I think, had this sense of what's going on, this categorization, and so he tells them 3 quick stories, 2 about some lost items, and the 3rd about a disrespectful son. We know that one as the prodigal. So a few of you know that one. So Jesus does not introduce his topic right away in these stories. And if you weren't kind of up on what Jesus was thinking, you might not understand exactly where he's going with the story. But eventually you're going to catch on because he gets to his point a little bit later. So the first story starts out this way. So Jesus told them this story. If a man has 100 sheep and one of them gets lost, what do you do? You know the answer to this one, right? You don't even have to read it. You don't have to know the story. What do you do if you have a lost sheep? You can respond. You go find it. That's what you do. That's logical, right? It's illogical to say, well, that's only one. It's illogical to say, well, that's only 1% shrinkage. No, you don't do that. You go looking for the one. And everybody in the crowd went, yep, that's what we would do. Verse 4 says, so won't he leave the 99 others in the wilderness and go search for the one that is lost until he finds it? Of course he will. Everyone's nodding and going, yep, that's what it is. No one says I have like 99, the one doesn't matter. Verse 5, and when he has found it, he will joyfully carry it home on his shoulders. When he arrives, he'll call together his friends and neighbors, saying, rejoice with me because I've found my lost sheep. Well, that might be a little overstated. I don't know. Maybe that's exactly what happens. I guess you really value sheep. You might do that. But maybe Jesus is just trying to make a point here. Maybe it's hyperbole. I'm not sure. But isn't it true that when you find something that you thought was lost, you actually feel better and more grateful once you have it back than before you lost it? Isn't that right? And isn't it true that when something is lost, we focus more attention on what is lost than what is found, at least if it has value to us? I'll give you an example. When our kids were young, 4, 2, and newborn, Elfie and I went to a local indoor shopping mall, and I lost Aaron, our oldest son. I lost him. Elfie had Katie and the Snuggly, and Aaron and Matt and myself had gone off to shop for things that were way more interesting than what Elfie was interested in looking at. And really, my logic was this: I'm going to go find the toy department because that's entertaining for my 2 boys. Don't have to spend much energy doing that kind of thing. And so we went into the toy department, and my 2-year-old and 4-year-old had different areas of interest. And so they're not together. But I'm a smart dad. I know my 2-year-old's more likely to wander away thoughtlessly than my 4-year-old. So I'm with my 2-year-old, keeping my eye on my 4-year-old. And at one point I look up and he's gone. I don't think much about it. I just call his name. He's probably just around the corner. But there's no Aaron that shows up. I call again a little louder. No Aaron. Now I get a little angst in my stomach. I'm afraid of Elfie at this point. To be honest. Because Aaron was right there, right? And so I call a little louder, and now the next thing I know, I'm running up and down the toy aisle calling for Aaron, looking for him. Thoughtless of Matt. I wasn't actually thinking about him. What I was thinking about is imagining this phone call to Elfie. Hey, Alf, I've lost Aaron, but good news, I still have Matt. No, actually, still having Matt isn't going to add anything positive to the conversation right there. Nothing. Because Aaron is lost. And that's what matters. Eventually, good news, found Aaron. He was doing his own thing and eventually found him. My life was saved. And it's a good news story, right? In the same way, Jesus says in verse 7, in the same way, there is more joy in heaven over one lost sinner. Now, if you're a sinner, you cringe a little bit when you hear that in the crowd. But one lost sinner who repents and returns to God, than over 99 others who are righteous and haven't turned away. Now, this is a little bit offensive to the Pharisees and religious experts. It's actually not a good start to the story for them, if you think about it. Jesus is opening the door to people who to them are out and untouchable, that they can be connected to God. That's what he's thinking. Jesus is saying heaven is way more thrilled over one person that you think is on the out, who finds the love of Jesus Christ and gets connected to his Father, than he is about the 99 who were already found. Now that's a bit disturbing, maybe. It was a little bit irritating to these Pharisees, for sure. Jesus tells another story because I think he sensed everyone was going to walk away at that point. He says, okay, so verse 8, or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Won't she light a lamp and sweep the entire house and search carefully until she finds it? Again, the answer is yeah. Now, what exactly is this thing with the silver coins? There's 3 or 4 ideas that people have come up. One is that she was really poor and those 10 coins were necessary for her livelihood. That could be it. Now, others have suggested that typical of the culture would be that if you had a daughter who reached womanhood and was of marrying age, you as a parents would give her a headband, sometimes with fine jewels in it or coins, and it was kind of an indicator that she was marriable. And the good thing was that if you married her, you got her, plus you got the headband. And that was a really good thing because it had value to it, right? And evidently, if that's what it was, a coin gets lost. Whatever it is, the coin's of great value, and she can't just leave home without that coin, whether it's the headdress or whatever it is. It's of great value to her. And so what does she do? What we would do. Search the house, high and low, find it, look for it, sweep the home till you find it along the way. And when she finds it, verse 9 tells us, she will call her friends and neighbors and say, "Rejoice with me because I have found my lost coin." Again, it might be a little overstated, unless, of course, the coin is of greater value to her than somebody else who might not value it quite so much. Either way, Jesus appears to be trying to get everyone on the same page, agreeing that if something of great value is lost, a great search ensues. How long? Till you find it. Because it is of something of great personal value to the person who has lost it. You lose your engagement ring, and someone comes along and goes, forget it, just get another one. Why can't you do that? Because it's not the ring, it's the person who gave it to you. That watch your granddad gave you, it doesn't even work. Why would you hold on to it? Why would you care that it gets lost? Because my granddad gave it to me. That's what gives it value. And so whether it's a coin or a sheep, it's something of great value. And then Jesus tosses this in again in the same way. In verse 10, there is joy in the presence of God's angels when even one sinner repents. In other words, if you could feel the emotion of the last 2 stories, how you feel when something of great value is lost, and how much you treasure it when you find it, then you'll understand the joy that God experiences with a single person who's disconnected from him, who gets connected to him. You get a bit of a sense of that. And then Jesus jumps right into the 3rd story, one that we're most familiar with. Verse 11 again, it says, to illustrate the point further, because people have not quite got exactly what Jesus is after. He tells them a 3rd story, and this is the way it starts. A man had 2 sons. You know how it finishes, right? In this story, it's a story of a dad who has 2 grown sons. One day the younger son comes to him and says, Dad, I've been thinking about something. You know, when you die, my brother and I are going to inherit all of your and mom's stuff. It's going to be ours. Well, I was thinking it could be a little while before you die. And I'm wondering if maybe we could just speed that timeline up a little bit, and that I could actually enjoy what I'm going to eventually get another day. I could enjoy it today already. Wouldn't that be pragmatic? Wouldn't that be good? I mean, like if you don't get stage 4 cancer or have a heart attack or a brain aneurysm or maybe have an industrial accident, I could be an old guy before I actually get to enjoy what's coming to me anyway. So Dad, in the prime years of my life, wouldn't you and Mom want me to be happy? So what do you think? What if we just pretend you're dead? And I get it all now. What do you say, Dad? Are you in on that deal? What would you say about a son or a daughter if they came to you and they said, hey, look, why don't you and Mom sell the house? Maybe you could rent, maybe that would be okay. Liquidate the business, stuff you've worked for and you got handed down from your dad. Get a regular job. Maybe cash in the 401k. Pay the taxes for sure and invest it in me. What do you think, Mom and Dad? Good deal? What does that say about your child and what they think about you? Oh, here's a couple of things it says. It says your son or your daughter are disconnected from you, even though they still live in your home. They're disconnected. It's a broken relationship. It also says that they want what you have. way more than they want you. You've been reduced to a disposable resource provider. And this would have sent Jesus' audience reeling. Like, we look at it and we go, that's so ridiculous. It's a mystical fake story. But I don't think it was so much for this group. I think they're reeling at this point. It's as unbelievable, but they're tracking with Jesus. They may have laughed at him, but they're connecting with what he's saying. Here's what's happening. This dad so badly wants to reconnect with his son. If you can believe this, he knows the son does not love him, and they have not had much of a relationship for some time. What's so shocking, not surprising, is that for all these years, this son has drifted from the family, and now he wants to drift away. It's been on the horizon. They've seen it coming. Maybe not this, but they've seen the disconnection happening. The relationship has been broken for a long time. The dad knows this, but the dad so badly wants to reconnect with his son that he actually does what the son asks him to do. Now, if you're going to stand back on that just a little bit, you're going to go, that is so enabling. That is so foolish. That is so ridiculous. That is unprofitable parenting right there. Or maybe, just maybe, with eyes wide open, this dad knows exactly what he's doing. He knows precisely the price he's going to pay. He knows exactly what's going down in the heart of that son. He knows for sure that they're disconnected. And there is no way back except maybe a shot that a ridiculous response of grace to his son, as ridiculous as that is, as enabling as it appears, maybe that's the only shot here. But it's worth a shot to me. And so he does this. Does he liquidate the business? Does he liquidate the 401k? Well, I don't know. But the kid gets what he wants. And when he does, he leaves town, packs up his stuff, grabs the cash and assets, and heads for a distant country. There he buys the good life for himself. Condos and cars and Rolexes and Ferraris, and as time passes, his expenditures outpace his cash flow, gets himself into a little bit of trouble. Creditors call, but he won't respond. Attorneys can't protect him. Friends abandon him, and he's destitute, which everybody in Jesus' audience would say, well, he deserves that. He had that coming. Eventually, he needs a job and he needs income, but he's burned so many bridges, and the only job that he can get is working for a local pig farmer. Hebrew, Jewish guy working for a pig farmer. You get that, like, irony, right? It's really something. And as he does, something triggers a thought in him, it appears. Maybe just a momentary burst of desperation, but he starts to regret something, and I think maybe he regretted something more than he did everything else, and that was that he was disconnected from his dad. I think he regretted the request. I think he regretted dishonoring his dad. But I think what he regretted more than anything else is that he and his dad were disconnected. That he was lost. That for all intents and purposes, he was on the outside of the continuum. He was one of the out people. He had been in, but now he was out. So he was disconnected, and he wasn't sure there was a way back. And Jesus' audience in that group are people who begin to put Jesus' thinking together, and they realize that he might just be talking about them in some way. Some of them know that they're disconnected from God, that they're lost, or they feel lost. And they wonder whether God ever thinks about them. They think about him, but does God ever think about them? Or wonder about them? Or even, would he ever want me back? Would he ever be interested in that? Would he ever make a way for that? Also in the crowd are religious experts, and they're thinking, are you kidding? God doesn't think about guys like that prodigal son. If God does think about it, he thinks about ways to abandon them, how to make them pay for what they've done. That's what God thinks about them. So The son has come to the end of himself, agonizes that he's disconnected and lost, and yet maybe, just maybe, not likely for sure, but I wonder if I still am the son of my father. And he thinks about home, and he wonders if home ever thinks about him. Filled with remorse and regret, he decides that possibly he could work his way back, at least into the same spatial place where his father is, the same location. Maybe he could be a paid employee and he could earn back some of the money that he had taken from his parents. That's what he would do. I'll just go to my dad and my mom, and I'll go, like, I know what I did, and I'll work for you the rest of my life. I'll probably never pay it back. But it's my way of, like, somehow being in the same locale as you. Is there a chance you would hire me, Dad? And he talks himself into it and out of it and back and forth, and he finally says, I have nothing else. I'm going to go try that. So in verse 20 it says, so he returned to his father. He's a broken and he's a contrite man. And the religious leaders and the religious types in Jesus' audience are thinking, oh, this is going to be great. Like when he shows up back home with Dad, this is going to be an interesting conversation for sure. If Dad will even welcome him, if Dad will even talk to him. You see, they knew the governing law that had been written way back in like Leviticus about if a son did this to his parents, if a son did this to his dad, this is what the outcome was. Find out the facts, no doubt he'll be guilty, and then kill him. I meant that. That's what it says. So these Jewish religious leaders are going, I know how this ends. Because Jesus is going to stand for the law. That's what he's going to do. Well, let's find out what Jesus stands for. So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming, filled with, would you? Cash. Would you? I think I'd be filled with hurt. Maybe a little anger, resentment, disgust, embarrassment. Like, to be honest, because I think in categories, and categories Jesus doesn't think in. So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming, filled with love and compassion. And the audience gasps and laughs. And said, wait. This whole thing just turned from dramatic to ridiculous. It really did. It wasn't like on the fringe of ridiculous already, but no father of any kind, in any kind of realistic story, would ever respond that way. Ever. To which Jesus might say, you're right. If the Father thinks about people and who matters the way you think about who matters and think about disconnected and lost people. So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming, filled with love and compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. Hold on there. Now the father is finally expending some energy on this son. Why didn't he do this when his son was on the way out the door? Why engage now? Here's why. Because Jesus, our Father, the Trinity, does not play relational games with you and me. He knows where we are. And if we're out on the way out the door, that's one posture. Another posture is, I'm destitute and desperate and have no way to get through this. I'm turning your direction, and you'll see his posture change like that. He wants a real relationship with his son. He doesn't want a pretend thing. He doesn't want a boss-employee relationship. He wants a real, legitimate relationship. So he runs to his son in an undignified way, in ways that sophisticated, intelligent people didn't do it. But he does, because his son has made a turn. And that's all it takes, is a turn. And he runs to him, embraces him, and kisses him. Like, you just got to see the irony of, here's this pig farmer's son, dirty, still from the pigsty. And his dad embraces his Jewish dad embraces him and kisses him. Gets pig slop on him. Like, go on, come on. Yep, that's the picture. And people in Jesus' audience are just reeling like this. This is over the top disgusting. Do you know why it was that for them? because what they thought about people was so vastly different than how Jesus thought about people. They thought about in and out, unclean and clean, sinner and not, touchable and untouchable. And the Son failed in all of these things. But Jesus did not see people this way. And an indicator of what he really saw and how he really thought is found in what he is going to say next. Verse 21 says, his son said to him, Father, he had this little cheat of what he's going to say. Father, I've sinned against both heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But his father said to the servants, quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger, sandals for his feet. Reestablish the father-son relationship and kill the calf that we've been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast. Verse 23. And the calf that we've been fattening must celebrate a feast for this son of mine. These are the categories Jesus thinks of. This son of mine was dead, but now he's returned to life. He was lost, but now he's found. This son of mine, this daughter of mine, status from the son's side had changed clearly. And the father knew that his son was disconnected, but he never stopped desiring and thinking of him as a son. Yes, had the son not come back, he and the father would never have reconnected. What a tragic story that would be. But to the father, he never reached the point of being the untouchable, no hope back, excommunicated from the family. It's possible that they would never have reconnected, and the story would have had a tragically different ending, but that ending would have been the choice of the son, not the father. He was dead to me. He wasn't dead. He was dead to me. I knew where he was, but disconnected. He didn't want me. But now he's alive. Those are categories for Jesus. He was lost. He was in the category of lost. Not despised, lost. But now he's in the found category. He was lost to me, but now he's found to me. We're reconnected. We're connected. And so the party began. Jesus is telling them and us that when I see people and when you see people, every set of eyes that you've ever looked into, your boss tomorrow morning, the next door neighbor this afternoon, the bully at school this next week, your coach, your hairstylist, your table host at noon today, the mechanic, the receptionist, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, every one of them, everyone, are in a category or in categories like Jesus describes. We might describe them by their ability or their morality or sexuality, race, language, or clothing, but Jesus thinks of them relationally connected to his Father or relationally disconnected to his Father. And now hold on. I'm going to wrap with this. And this is a little disturbing. Jesus' primary concern, his primary priority, my priority, our priority because his body. But Jesus would say, I am concerned about everyone, but my primary concern is those who are disconnected from my Father. That's my primary concern. My passion, my first thought, my greatest focus, the very thing that I came to this world for was for the people who are in the dead and lost category. Because I want them to be alive, and I want them to be found, and I want them to be connected, and that's my priority. The reason Jesus spent so much time with people in the out category is not because they were in the out category. It's because they were disconnected from his Father. He spent so much time, his whole ministry, with people who were far from God. Do you know why? Because they were far from God. And that was his priority, to help them come close to God. And we are his body. But do we think of people with that kind of priority? You see, our tendency, our default, the gravitational pull of this church and every believer is for us to want to be with alive and found people. To drift, to move toward other alive and found people. The magnetic pull is to always toward the 99 and the 9. It's actually against our nature to drift toward the 1. Here's the great danger. If we give in to that magnetic pull, we'll increasingly and maybe even completely begin to think of people the way our culture does, and to use the category our culture does. Good, bad, moral, immoral, conservative, liberal, rich, poor, and so on. And we will lose the compassionate and loving way that Jesus sees people, connected or disconnected. Now, if you've been around Copper Hills, you'll know that my big concern, my big rock concern, has not been programs, has not been the finances of our church or what we teach. Now, believe me, those are important. They really are important. But the concern that is the big concern for me has been this for a long time. That we would drift toward being neighbors, and then a group of Jesus followers are only here to satisfy our own desires, to pursue our own spiritual thirst, to focus on our own priorities and our own interests and our own preferences, and not give full attention to the priority that was Jesus Christ's priority. And we say we follow him. And what he cared about is whether people were disconnected or connected to himself. The rest of the story Jesus tells is that of the older son, who's all bent out of shape. Do you know why? Because the dad in that season didn't make him the priority. The dad in that season made the younger son, who the older son didn't care much for, the priority. But the dad threw a party anyway. You know what throwing a party around here means for us? If there's ever going to be a time where we're going to cheer and applaud and clap and make noises that we shouldn't make and all that stuff, it's going to be when there's a tank up here and someone gets baptized. Not because like there are like more people getting baptized. It's because it reflects somebody was disconnected from God and they got connected. The very thing that all of heaven parties over is that thing. And I have to be transparent. We don't have enough of your friends and my colleagues and your colleagues being baptized. And I can't quite figure out whether that matters to us or not. Whether we're heartbroken over the people that Jesus has put us next to. Doesn't matter to us. It does to him. It's why he came. My dream would be, and it doesn't matter, it's my dream, is that tank would be perpetually sitting here. That you and I would be baptizing my colleagues, your colleagues, my friends, your friends. Because they're standing in front of the world and saying, I was once disconnected, but I'm connected now. Oh, that Jesus would do that, right? Well, we need to engage with what his priority is. All right, Jesus. We're not going to sing that last song, by the way. Sorry. Jesus, your love for the lost and the dead is so profound. Many of us would tell a story like this son who drifted and wondered if there was a way back. But because you prioritize disconnected people, we're back and we're connected. Jesus, would you, by the power of your Spirit, work deeply in our hearts? Deeply. Would you change our thinking if somehow or other our own comfort, our own spiritual satisfaction is what is the priority? And reform us into people like you who think like you. For the sake of our community, our neighbors, our world. I'll leave that with you now, Jesus. Have your way here. Amen. All right, so I'm supposed to tell you a couple of things that are coming up. One is if you're interested in finding out a little more about Copper Hills, Elfie and I are hosting a Copper Hills 101 this Wednesday. You can contact the church office on that if you would want to. We have produced Well Project 2 receipts. If you want to know kind of where your giving is at this point to the Well Project, those are out in the lobby area. Somebody will meet you there and give those to you. And then next week, our parking lot's going to be torn up. And so if you can park at different places, here's a bit of a map of where you can park. We'll send that out this week as well by email to everybody and in our trending, and you can catch up there. All right? All right, would you stand with me, please? Now, may the Lord bless you, and may he keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you. May he lift his countenance to you and flood you with his peace. Go in his grace, eyes opened to the people God puts you around for his fame. Amen.